Good morning. I was very fortunate to be given two wonderful lots of pottery recently. Everyone knows that I'm a big fan of pottery, and so they very kindly passed on things that they didn't need anymore. A huge collection from Tobias, which we'll go through in a minute, and 3 wonderful pieces of interesting stoneware from Blaine. So we'll go through those as well. So we can run through a whole history of pottery from medieval times onwards. So this is some of the pottery I collected from Tobias, and as you can see there is a lovely selection to look through. So starting with the earliest pieces, we have 4 pieces here of medieval Surrey whiteware, which would be 1350 to 1500. You can tell the fabric is medieval because of the inclusions in the clay. So you can clearly see it's got little black specks, and if you look closer you can see little white specks in the clay and a green glaze, which would be typical of the medieval period. So we have a rod handle from a small jug, and you can see on the other side the way that the potter has quite crudely fixed it in and stabbed it to help release vapour in the kiln. You can see also the medieval style inclusions on this cistern bung. So this is the base of a cistern. When people started brewing started in the 13th century but became popular in the 15th century. So towards the end of the medieval period, people would brew their own light beer to drink, as the water wasn't very palatable. So on into the post-medieval period. This is a very frequently found type of pottery on the foreshore and everywhere else around the country. Post-medieval redware. So it's often quite humble, used for cooking and storage and industrial uses. The earliest bits here are slip-coated. So this is slip-coated post-medieval redware, which was made in and around London from about 1480 to 1600, and you can see the white edge around the glaze that remains is the remains of the coating of slip, which was put on first, I think to make the vessel look a bit lighter in colour than the heavy clumpy redware which people were used to. Quite often pottery at this period has a grey core as well, because there wasn't the control over the temperature in the kiln that there was later. Post-medieval redware was made right through from the 16th century to the early 19th century. And it's often very humble things like this pipkin, which you can see has been sooted from standing in a fire cooking, and that handle, probably another handle on the other side, a simple vessel. You also commonly encounter vessels with thumbing below the rim, so this is the potter's thumbs that he's made that decoration with. It also helped to grip a heavy pot as you lifted it, full of liquid or full of stew. These were made in London, that's upside down, around Woolwich and other places as well. A little bit more unusual to spend this much time decorating quite a humble piece of pottery, but the potter has made a little rosette or stylised flower with his thumbs there and some rilling around there, and this matches very closely a vessel which was discovered in Suffolk, which dates to the late 18th century. This too is an interesting piece. Again, it's been thumbed, but it's actually a handle, probably a bucket handle. You imagine that way up with the vessel below it there. And and just helps with the grip, but also gives a pleasing bit of decoration as well. A lot of industrial wares were made out of red earthenware. These are identifiable as sugar cone moulds to make the sugar cones that people would cut pieces of sugar off, and they were often slipped inside. So they were wiped inside with white slip, which helped to release the sugar cone when it was ready. Normally they have quite a wide rim, and that's where the molasses would drain away from the sugar. This one is a tiny little sugar cone with a tiny little opening there. And only the best quality and most expensive sugar was put into these small sugar cone moulds. So that would have graced the table of London's well-to-do. Borderwares find their way to London from 1550. The white clay ones are sold in London until about 1700, and the red clay slightly later. So borderware pipkin, pipkin free-footed cooking vessel, a hollow handle to help it keep cool. The borderware examples don't go through the body of the vessel, and then a pipkin in pinkish clay with an external lid seating, so the lid would go over the top of that and be held by the flange there. These wide-rimmed fragments would have probably come from chamber pots or stool pans, which would have been set into a wooden piece of furniture, the wide rim giving you a bit of comfort as you sat on it. Rather nice horizontal handle, probably from a porringer, which was made to contain quite wet food. Not a lot of borderware is decorated. This is probably the rim of a plate or dish, so that's a nice find as well. At this time, London imported a lot of pottery, so you get the ubiquitous German stoneware from the 16th century through the 17th century. So there's two fragments from a Bartman jug, the mouth and beard from the neck, and then this one, you can see one cross on it, and there will be another two crosses. Ahead is a roundel with the arms of Amsterdam, which did a lot of trade and sent a lot of stoneware in London's direction at this time. Another German import. This is a bit of slipware, and it comes from Werra in Germany, and that would have been part of a highly decorated plate, maybe with an animal figure or a human figure in the inside. This is an interesting piece. It's very micaceous redware, so I think it comes from Spain or Portugal, probably Spanish, I would think. Obviously it's meant for pouring out liquid, perhaps olive oil or wine, and this would be 16th or 17th century as well, but an example of another sort of import that reached London at this time. Slightly later German stoneware imports from Westerwald. These date from the late 17th century through the 18th century. These are two outstanding examples of Westerwald jug fragments. They had a lot of stamped motifs, and these scoring marks are like stems or twigs or vegetation which would have held the flowers in place. And lovely stamped motifs on this piece as well, and the cobalt decoration, and the purple is manganese, which would date it to the end of the 17th century. More everyday jug fragments. There's a massive jug there, and you can just see the beginning of the cobalt decoration there, and the handle where it would have taken. No face mask by this date, and that's a slightly overcooked cobalt glaze, and again the handle springing from that jug there, also from the Best of Out in Germany. A bit of homegrown, highly fired earthenware, practically stoneware. It's Midlands purple, or butter potware, as a lot of butter was imported into London in these large conical cylindrical pots with a rough glaze there. So these would be 17th century or early 18th century in date. A couple of early examples of slipware. On the left we have Metropolitan Slipware from Harlow in Essex, with this slip trail decoration of a leaf, I think, or a tree. This dates from about 1640 to 1720. And then roughly the same date you have a borderware rim from a plate or a charger, and this just has a very simple wavy trail of slip there, and then once it's glazed it gets this yellow colour. I was very lucky to be given this lovely group of tin glazed earthenware shards, very typical of their time. These are mainly plates and chargers. So they have a wide heavy foot rim for a charger. This is probably the earliest piece. It's got a stylised flower there in the Wan Li decoration, which is imitating Chinese porcelain, about 1650. The English Delftware goes from the 1650s up to about 1800. So some more large pieces of hand-painted tin-glazed earthenware. This one's been lead glazed on the back, which is an earlier feature, probably late 17th century, to save on costs a bit. Whereas this one, a bit later, 18th century, is tin glazed on the back, and you can see where the glaze is very fragile and has chipped off there. There's some lovely spontaneous decoration, decorative style, dashes, dots, swirls, roundels, mostly in blue and white, but obviously there's some yellow been added to this piece here. Again, that is the base of a large dish, and that's nearer the rim. A bit later, through the 18th century, you get individual plates becoming popular from 1720, and often with a nice rim pattern there in a polychrome multicoloured thing, made in Lambeth in huge quantities, and then decorative style there, more little scrolls and foliage. This is from a drainer. Not many of these survive today, but you can see it's been pierced before it was glazed, and it's got this stylised tree pattern with some twigs there. And part of a candlestick. It probably would have had another stem part going down there. Just plain white tin glazed earthenware, which again doesn't survive much. Mostly it's the highly decorated bits that you see in museums these days. Drug and ointment jars, often decorated simple blue patterns, lines and dots. used to contain medicine and ointments. This is my absolute favourite bit of tin glazed earthenware that Tobias gave me. These little pimples are quite distinctive of the tin glaze as well. It's decorated both sides, but on the other side you get a lovely 18th century gentleman there. And this red enamel decoration probably means it's made in Liverpool. Liverpool Delftware was sold in London, mid-18th century, and I think he's probably a shepherd and he's playing a pipe there. So there's a picture of a similar piece coming up. I absolutely love this 18th century rustic gentleman. So I mentioned that tin glazed earthenware was trying hard to be Chinese export porcelain imported into the country in large quantities throughout the 18th century. And this is an example, or two examples, of Chinese export porcelain, which is a bit bluer tinged than the homegrown variety, which starts in the 1740s. It's got a very glassy fracture and a very dense structure. But if we compare the scroll pattern on the Chinese example with the scroll pattern on the tin glazed earthenware, then you can see at once a similarity in decoration between the Chinese piece and the English made piece. A lot of tiles were made in tin glazed earthenware, both in Holland and here, for putting in fireplaces and in alcoves, and these are very good examples of that. There's a lovely scene here of a man fishing. There's his fishing rod, and there's a couple of sails of boats in the distance there. Plain tiles with a little flower in the middle. That's very typical of the style of an edge tin glazed earthenware tiles. And then this lady here, she has a round double lined circle around her. Biblical tiles were very, very popular in London in the 18th century, and I tracked this down to show Potiphar's wife. So she's beckoning towards the fabric of her bed, and she's sitting down and trying to tempt Joseph to come there. So there's a couple of examples of similar styles. Obviously, because it's hand painted, every factory and every painter had a slightly different style, but the placing of the figures and their gestures were very much the same. So you can see there's one London example and one Bristol example, with the gesture being the same. The Bristol example, she's actually gone a stage further and she's actually got her Bristols out to tempt Joseph even a bit further. The coming of stoneware and creamware killed off tin glazed earthenware, because obviously the stoneware was much more durable and the glaze didn't chip off or get stained at all. This a little moulded plate rim, probably from Staffordshire, 1740 to 1760, slightly scalloped edge there of a white salt glazed stoneware plate. You also get a lot of slipware made in Staffordshire, Bristol and London itself. This piece is undoubtedly from Staffordshire. The dish, it's a baking dish, large dish, has been moulded and then there's been heavily trailed in two different colours of slip. So this is 18th century. At the end of the 17th and the 18th century they would have jewelled these bits with little dots of extra decoration, but I still like that piece for the sort of stylised flower on it. And this is the edge of a baking dish, so they all have that little scalloped edge, but what is beautiful about this is that they've made the scallops using a little shell. So they've decorated, pressed a shell in to make a little edge to that baking dish, which just raises it above the normal slipware dish. And then a closed form in slipware, you can just see the edge of some decoration there. This would be a honey pot, or maybe a mug, or a posset pot, something of that type. 18th century as well. So examples of creamware and pearlware, which, as I said, killed off tin glazed earthenware and became fantastically successful, being exported all around the world and used in this country. The remains of a basket shaped bowl and a little handle there. Feather edged plates became popular from 1780. This could also be 19th century, with a little impressed and painted decoration there. Hand painted decoration on the cheaper pieces. Again, this could be 19th century or late 18th. And a bit more elaborate, so painted in polychrome, a number of different colours, but you can clearly see the blue edging where the little bit of cobalt added to the glaze to make it whiter has pooled around the rim there. So this is going to be pearlware, and that's 1780 through to about 1830, probably from the decoration around 1800. So by this time industrialisation is well underway, and you get large factories producing huge quantities of pottery. Not to say that the personal touch has not disappeared. So these are all examples of decoration, industrial slipwares and mocha ware. So the mocha ware is made by adding chemicals onto the surface of the pot there, and they sort of tendril out into these wonderful shapes like seaweed and trees, mainly blue but also green obviously, and often with a yellow ground and lines of decoration there. Very common, started in the late 18th century and right through the early Victorian period as well. This little piece they've cut away with a turning engine different strips which they've slipped it, and then they've cut away the colour to reveal the clay colour underneath and given it that checkered border as well. This is a lovely piece of industrial slipware. So they've used a multi-spouted slip applicator, a little funnel which you pour different colours of slip in, and then you could get this trailed effect coming through there onto the refined earthenware vessel. Different stoneware bodies were very popular at this time. So you get black basalt, which is harking back to a classical form and style of decoration. That's a stoneware there with engine turned decoration. Sometimes also given a glaze. So this piece has been given like a transfer print in a different yellowish glaze there on a black heavily glazed surface. This piece is probably much later, it may have come off a piece of furniture. It's a typical Wedgwood Jasperware plaque with a white clay sprig added, but this started being made in the 18th century and continues right up to the present day. Obviously, anywhere you go on the foreshore you're going to find bits of transfer printed earthenware. This was the dominant decorative style in the late Georgian and right through the Victorian period. So a lot of this will be Georgian or Victorian in date. An interesting piece is this lady here who is holding on a stick the Cap of Liberty. which is something to do with the French Revolution, or it could be a Napoleonic War period as well. After the willow pattern, this pattern is the next most commonly found on the foreshore. It's probably had a wild rose border, and it shows Courtney Newnham House and a bridge and people boating there, and you've got the same transfer print on the inside of this large, probably a tureen, I would think, but this would be late Georgian in date. Well, how's this for a fantastic beast with a lovely forked tongue? So that's transfer printed rather than hand painted. But what a fantastic image, I love it. With the Victorian period, we enter a realm of mass-produced containers and packaging of different sorts, and stoneware was probably the most widely used body. And we're going to have a look at a few pieces now. So simple cylindrical bottles made in their millions. This has got a nice mark, Joseph Bourne and Son, Denby Pottery Patentee. So that's in the Midlands, and this will be early Victorian in date, I should think, or mid-Victorian. Again, a lot of ginger beer bottles or lemonade bottles are whites in this case, and amazingly these were all hand thrown. So this piece here is pierced, and that comes from a stoneware water filter, which again was very commonly used on ships and on land. Stoneware also used to make little tiles, and that's a rather nice complete tile from someone's front doorstep. Many more pieces. Everyday thing, that's a cream pot from the 1880s onwards. These were used once to contain cream and then discarded, so you get a lot of those. And this is actually part of a stoneware spittoon. So in cheap pubs and hotels you have these vessels, and there would have been a hole in the centre here, and so you could spit after chewing your tobacco or whatever else you were doing, and it would run down into the hole there. So that's absolutely delightful. But even that was made with some moulded design and a little bit of pride in its manufacture, even though it's the most humble of items. From the 1830s onwards, and getting increasingly more popular and totally supplanting the salt glaze stoneware, is this Bristol glaze, which is like a honey colour on a palish background, and sometimes there's zones of glaze with the background colour beneath. This will be from a flagon, a large drink container for cider or beer, or maybe for chemicals, cleaning chemicals. So these became very popular towards the later half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. So stoneware items are not without their beauty. I mentioned the decorated tile already, but you also get moulded jugs in coloured stoneware from the 1840s onwards. So that would have a design there. And also commemorative pieces and art pottery towards the end of the century. This actually goes into the early 20th century. AR for Queen Alexandra, and it's a Coronation Mug from 1902, made by Dalton of Lambeth, and they've got the England, which means it's after 1891, but we know it's 1902 because you've got the AR, Alexander Regina. On the other side you'd have King Edward VII. Here's a piece of stoneware with a very specific function. It's got a screw thread there for putting a stopper on, and some floral decoration around that there, and it actually comes from a stoneware hot water bottle. So these you'd put in your bed and obviously fill with hot water and then screw, hopefully tight, the stopper there. So I'll post a picture of one so you can see what the complete item would have looked like. Victorian period is definitely one for packaging, and you've got different items here which we'll run through. Pots and earthenware and stoneware especially. This one, very late 19th century, early 20th century, virol, a preparation of bone marrow, an ideal fat food for children and invalids. Doesn't sound very appetising, but it's nice that you've got the whole pot with the transfer printed label on it. Preserve jars, made in their millions and found all over the world. Just plain ribbed, late 19th, early 20th century. And the famous Keeler's Dundee marmalade, which you also find everywhere, the late 19th century as well. Ointments and creams would be in these pots, and you would have had probably a nice advertising pot lid on the top as well, explaining what the contents were. It could be toothpaste, bear's grease, all sorts of ointments. This one is nice because it's still got the details of what was in it. So it is Singleton's Garden Eye Ointment. This was made in Lambeth, and that's the part where the ointment would have been. So this is a lot of packaging and a very little bit of ointment there for your eyes. And these were made originally in tin glazed earthenware and right through into the 20th century. Some interesting figurines. Again, these are probably 19th century. A headless dandy. From the base and the markings there, I think he's probably German or continental. Then you've got an arm there of another person dressed in the 18th century style, but probably 19th century. And then a little Victorian boy with some simple blue painted decoration on him there. A couple more frequently found ceramic finds from all over the country. Sunderland style slipware, baking dish, as early as 1800 but still being made in 1900. Some had a compartment in the middle as well for doing two types of food. And some lovely spongeware, made in Scotland a lot, but also in Staffordshire. And they take a sponge and cut a design and then stamp multiple times around there. So it's a lovely rose and a border around a vessel or a cup there. This too is stoneware, and it's an import. It is a Chinese ginger jar with blue painted decoration, stylised landscape, and this would be late Victorian or early 20th century as well. With any assemblage you also get some mystery pieces. This is tin glazed but on a red clay body. I think it's probably French, maybe from Quimper or Quimper, not sure. Quimper, how do you pronounce it? So it's quite late, probably late Victorian rather than earlier tin glazed earthenware from the UK. And a lovely decorated piece here, but I haven't found a parallel for it. I imagine it's probably imported maybe from France or Germany, and I guess it's going to be probably late 18th or 19th century. But anyway, thank you to Tobias for such a wonderful tour through the history of pottery and a good example of what you can find on the Thames foreshore. Okay, I'm now going to run through the 3 pieces of stoneware that Blaine sent me, which was very generous of him. These two come from the same sort of vessel, and they're both Westerwald, so we're talking late 17th or early 18th century, probably 18th century I would think. And they both come from a chamber pot. So it's nice that they did some elaborate moulding on these humble items. And this is a wonderful lion. There you can see his tail arching over his back and his claw facing forward. I'll post a picture of a complete one so you can see. And you can see the cobalt decoration around the edge there. And this lovely stamped medallion made with a mould that was pressed in, and you have lions either side. I think, of those as well. So that was really nice to have. But this is the piece that I really treasure because it's early English stoneware. So the shape would be the same as a Bartman bottle, but it's actually made in London by John Dwight in the 1670s. So there were so many German stoneware imports that people decided that they'd have a go at making some. So there were several sort of small-scale attempts, but John Dwight of Fulham really was an innovator and an experimenter. He tried to make porcelain, he tried to make white stoneware. He was quite litigious in stopping other people making stoneware. He wanted the monopoly. But in the 1670s and 1680s, he produced these wonderful mugs and gorges, which is a round-bellied mug, and bottles with loads of different monograms. And this one is a very patriotic one. So it's the King's Crown and then 2 entwined C's for Charles II. So this is some of the earliest English stoneware made in London, in Fulham. And I say the shape is in the style of the German pieces, but the roundels and monograms are in a very English style. So I was absolutely delighted to get that. The colour is slightly lighter than the German, and if you look closely you can see little specks of black in the clay, which is an indication that it's London made. So they excavated John Dwight's pottery at Fulham in the 70s. And this bust made by John Dwight of himself in white stoneware is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, but he really was an innovator and very famous in the history of pottery production in this country. Here are examples of the crowned double C monogram, which was made in a variety of different sizes and decoration, and also with different borders. So here are some of the different borders used, and you can see 311 or 313 match the border there on the piece that I was given. So all in all, delighted to have a piece of 17th century English stoneware from London, and thank you again to Blaine for your generosity in passing it on. I will treasure it. Well, exciting news. I hope to be back to the foreshore soon, hopefully this week with Nick White of Tideline Art, so watch this space. See you soon. Bye.